In this video, we're going to look at the full configuration for a pipeline and jobs set up to make use of dynamic jobs. Specifically, to what we're going to do is migrate one article that has referenced content and an HTML body that actually has images referenced in it. And we'll see how our dynamic job is able to pick out the assets that we want to migrate over, migrate those assets, and then migrate the article, updating values and setting values as appropriate. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at our source where we have this article content. And notice here we'll have just a number of different fields. Not everything we're going to be migrating here in this video, but we're interested specifically in this body field, which has a image tag here that will be migrating over this asset and updating the URL to the appropriate destination URL. We also have this featured image, which is actually a reference to a media entity content type. And this is a separate piece of content that's being referenced that itself references the actual asset or image that needs to be migrated over. So what we'll be doing is we'll be migrating the featured image asset, we'll be migrating the body asset as well, and making sure that both these assets migrate over and having them be properly referenced at our destination for this article. Now, taking a look at our impulse configuration, what we'll see here is we have a pipeline set up with a number of different steps. What we can see here is we have our first step has the populate dynamic store. So this job will actually first start by populating dynamic storage values to start picking up the asset values as necessary. Our second step will start delivering some of these assets, such as the assets picked up from the body, which have been previously stored, as well as actually populate storage again with additional data from our media entity content, which has that featured image binary, as well as additional metadata like a caption field, which we need to store and will make use of in our article. Our next step is going to be, again, another dynamic asset pickup. This time we're picking up the featured image because now we're able to dynamically pick up the featured image since we've now populated the storage from our media entity. And finally, we have our article sync, where we'll be migrating that article content, which is where what the content we're interested actually in migrating over, and we'll see how its featured image and body are referencing the appropriate destination assets that have been migrated over. So now we can go ahead and take a look at the job configuration for each of these jobs in turn. We'll go ahead and start with the populate dynamic store, where if we take a look at it, we'll see that our source connector and destination endpoints are both set up to basically deliver or pick up content from the source, but not deliver it anywhere to any destination. Because in this case, we don't need to deliver this content. What we're interested in doing is using our dynamic job store manipulator to take values from our content and store these values. Now, let's take a note that we are picking up the article content type. So we're going to be parsing values from our article content for dynamic storage. Now, taking a look at our manipulators, we'll take a look at each one real quick. First, notice here we have our storage path for the media entity ID. So this will help us identify which values to pick up for different dynamic jobs. In this case, this dynamic job value that we're storing is going to be for our media entity content. So we're going to store the media entity ID that we are referencing to be able to dynamically pick it up and not have to pick up all the media entities, but just this one media entity for this article. So we're making use of a few liquid templates to pick up what value we want to store. In this case, we are storing specifically the target ID or the contents ID value for the system. So that way we can use it in a query in our dynamic job. Now, similarly, in our second dynamic job store manipulator, we are going to be doing something similar, but instead of immediate entity content, we're picking up the actual asset based on a value parsed out from an HTML body. So we're going to be storing these dynamic values along this path called file name, because we're going to be basically parsing out what is the file name or used in the URI, and we're going to query the URI for the name that we're storing from our source system. So in our store value and store key, again, we have two liquid templates where we're actually making use of the ability to create an array and store an array of values here, which is some of what this extra templating logic is for, where we're going to basically parse out for every image sourced, every image tag in our HTML. We want to find what the source value is. We'll get the URI name or the file name from this source URL value and add it to the array we're going to store into dynamic storage. And in this case, we're basically using the same store value as the store key for easy identification and matching up. So here we're storing first our media entity ID that we need to pick up for referencing the featured image, and we're also storing the asset IDs of the assets that are referenced in our HTML body. Now, one of the next jobs that runs is the actual dynamic asset pickup for those body images we just stored. So if we take a look at its configuration, we'll notice our source endpoint has the impulse asset, so we're picking up asset content here from the system. And in our query, we will have our replace query value, as well as our dynamic storage path. Now this is how we're signifying this job needs to be dynamically use our dynamic storage to dynamically update that query value. And notice we have our dynamic storage path file name, which matches the same storage path from our dynamic job store manipulator for the files names from the HTML body. And here we're going to basically be querying the system using the file name values we parsed out from the HTML body, where we want to take this value, we'll replace it with each file name, and search the system for when the URI contains that value. Now we will be delivering this content, so we have our destination endpoint, and we have a couple of store manipulators where we want to store the URL and the URL of the file, so where it currently lives in its source system, and we're going to basically store that based from its file name. So our URL, or part of our URL, is going to be the storage key, and our storage value is actually the file name. And our second store manipulator is going to make use of storing the ID, again, where the key has the URL or part of the URL parsed out appropriately, with the ID just a signifier to help identify it as a different storage value from our first store manipulator. And we're going to store the content ID. So these two store manipulators are actually configured to store the content ID and the file name based on the URL from the source system. Now we're going to do this because our article job is going to update the source value in its HTML to be the appropriate source URL to the destination system. Because we're no longer able to use our old source URL to reference the old system's image, now we need to update the URL to reference the new system's image. Now, the next job that we run in this pipeline is the dynamic media entity, where we're going to again populate storage. Now this does two things. One, we're actually going to create it as a dynamic job where we're going to pick up the media entity based on our dynamic stored values. Remember, we stored the media entity ID originally. In addition to the assets from the HTML body, we also stored this media entity ID. So we're now going to make use of that stored value, update our query to pick up our appropriate media entity content. Now we're not interested in delivering this content. Instead, we're just going to store values from it. So what we'll see first is we're going to store two specific values. One, we have the value of the caption. So we're going to store the caption based on the content's ID. So we'll store the caption metadata for that this content has. And we'll also store the actual reference to the image that this content has as well. So we're storing the metadata of this asset that the content store has, as well as the reference to the asset that this content has. We're also going to set up some more dynamic job storage here, where we're going to migrate. We want to store the asset that we actually reference because we still need to deliver that asset from our source to our destination. So here we'll see our store value and store key using liquid templates to store the appropriate system ID value that we want to query by. And our storage path will be signified with file ID. Now the next job that runs is this last dynamic asset pickup featured image, and this is that asset that we just stored with our media entity content. So we stored the asset that we reference, and we now need to pick it up and deliver it. So we have our source endpoint configured to pick up our assets, and our dynamic job set up to use the dynamic storage path file ID, which matches that dynamic storage path option that we set in the previous job, and our query set up to query based off the file ID, which is the value we stored. So we'll pick up our specific file and migrate it over to our destination system. Now this doesn't have any manipulators because this featured image doesn't need to store any additional data, unlike the body images did. Now, the final job that will be run in this pipeline is the actual article sync. So we've done all this work with these other jobs to dynamically populate storage, to be able to migrate the images and the assets over as necessary. We've done storage values to store different URLs so we can and IDs to be able to properly reference and retrieve caption metadata values, storage image, and update the URL in the body as necessary. So looking at the article configuration here, what we'll notice is this job actually is not a dynamic job. Instead, we're just migrating our content, our article content, where we just want to pick it up and migrate it. There was no dynamic pickup here because we know which content we want to pick up. We're not dynamically creating this list in this case. We're obviously delivering it to our destination, and we have a couple manipulators here set up. Some manipulators, such as this, are for the system we're delivering into to set up something like the global field for the content stack destination. And then our liquid field manipulators are actually going to populate our values as necessary. So what we'll see here is first we have our featured image field is going to be our file field type, and we're going to be migrating and populating this value. So notice here we're using a liquid template to search our storage for what is file hyphen the actual ID of the featured image that we're referencing. So we want to take what the storage value is. We'll retrieve that stored value, which will be the ID we want to reference at our destination. And we will then create a relationship pointing to the ID of the image that we want to reference. And that's here what we can see we're building in our liquid template. Our second liquid field is going to adjust our body field where we have our HTML with many different one-to-many different image sections, and every image section needs its source updated. So what we're going to do is use a liquid template that will iterate through every image source, take the value, and based on that old URL from the current image source, which points to our old URL at our original source system, we're going to search our storage for the ID of the new content, as well as the new URL necessary. Remember, because we stored these values when we migrated our assets, we stored some of these values, such as the file name and the content ID. So now we're going to retrieve those stored values and actually build our new URL using a combination of static value that we know, as well as creating the URL where we are updating our content ID from our old source ID to our new destination ID. And the URL also takes the content version ID. So we'll be setting the content version ID and the file name to create our entirely new URL to reference this image at our destination system. Now, once we do that, we're going to basically replace the image source that we found with our new URL. So our old URL was used to search storage because that's how we stored the ID and the file name. And we built our new URL using our ID and file name. And we'll replace our old URL with our new URL in the HTML body. Finally, our last liquid field manipulator will set up the featured image caption field, where again, we're going to go to storage. We're going to search storage for that caption data that we had stored from our media entity content, where we had picked up the media entity. We stored a couple values such as the reference to the file as well as the caption field. Now we're going to retrieve our caption field and set it for our featured image caption fields for this article content we're migrating. Now we do have a small mapper here for migrating the source content to our destination article, where we have some simple source and destination field mapping, as well as some additional properties set up for our destination system that we're migrating into. Now, that covers all of the configuration for Impulse Sync and how to set up this pipeline and the job and dynamic jobs and such. We can take a look at our destination after having run this pipeline. And what we'll see here, we have our two images migrated over. This is the image from our body HTML, and here is our featured image from that media entity content. If we look at the content itself, here's our article that we've migrated over. We have that title set and configured. Now we do have our body, and notice here we have our reference, our image in our body properly referenced. If we look at the HTML itself, we'll find our image and we'll see that our source value is that updated value. So it's no longer what the source system from Drupal 7 is referencing. It's now a proper image reference URL for our destination content stack system. Moving down, we have our featured image, where we have our featured image actually referenced. So this is that asset properly being referenced now. In addition, notice that we have the featured image caption as well, where we were able to take our caption value from our media entity content type and put it into our article content type for the featured image itself. So this is the configuration and an example of how to be able to make use of our pipeline using storage, dynamic jobs, and fitting it all together to make this kind of a migration process be able to work for you. Thanks for watching.